Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and over the past couple of days I've found the time to write up another article, and as always that means that I'm going to be making a video version of it, but if you'd rather read it than listen to it, you can feel free to do so by following the link in the description below. So, as you may have noticed, I'm no longer a member of the CSM, and after handover took place near the start of this month, leaving CSM 14 all on their own, I was able to mention a few final things to members of CCP that I had talked to a lot during my time in the role. And chief among the topics that I broached during that time was, as this video is titled, my observation that capitals have effectively made subcapitals redundant in a large majority of roles in EVE. And this is something that Arendis touched on in his excellent article, Why the Nullsec Blackout Won't Fix EVE, which I do recommend you read. But I wanted to dive a little deeper into some of the things that capitals and supercapitals do currently, and why I think that their ability to perform and more accurately dominate certain roles is detrimental to the game overall. Now, people with long histories of playing the game might remember a time when supercarriers, or motherships as they were known during that time, could use regular drones. And its power during that time was similar to the Pantheon or Slowcat/boot doctrines that various alliances started to use in 2013 to 2014, reaching its apex with the Wrecking Ball formation that saw its own demise with the drone assist changes in Rubicon. But what I found most interesting after going back to dig up this old change and the discussions that actually took place during that time was the specific reasoning that CCP used to justify their nerf in taking away access to these regular drones from supercarriers. And it goes as follows, quote, "The reason that supercarriers can deal with almost any size of ship is the versatility provided by its massive drone bay. Having access to almost unlimited combat drones of all sizes and being able to launch 20 of them at a time means that they have an answer to almost any situation. In fact, we found that drones on capital ships in general tend to be detrimental to the way fleet fights should work. If you want to deal with subcapitals, you should bring your own subcapitals or a carrier." And in that quote, something that I've long believed to be the case is confirmed to have once been CCP's view on the matter, that in order to deal with subcapitals, you should bring something that subcapitals have a chance to kill, in order to give the attacker a reasonable ability to fight back without forcing them to have to bring their own capital fleet to bear. And this gives smaller groups a reasonable chance of making an impact against larger, more capital-focused groups on a small level. And this ideal is something that CCP only reinforced when stating their goals during the 2016 rebalance, which led to the current state of capital design. Quote, "Before we started looking at details, we wanted to firmly fix the goal of the design for capitals. Provide interactive, meaningful gameplay. Obtaining and mastering capital ships, as well as fighting and destroying them, should be a compelling aspirational goal for players. Capital ships are the premier weapons for killing structures, and capital ships should be effective in most combat situations without completely dominating the battlefield and invalidating other ship types." What I hope to do during this video is to demonstrate the various ways in which capitals and supercapitals fail to achieve these goals, by dominating the battlefield and invalidating other ship types, whilst removing the ability for players to have meaningful interactions with them. And as always, I try and be constructive in my feedback, so I'll be including what I consider to be some easy ways for CCP to fix this, should they actually understand the problem, and agree with my assessment. I doubt that you, the listener, will agree with me on every point or suggested change, but that's what the comment section is for, so feel free to call me an idiot or whatever epithet you prefer there. Section 1. Supers, Carriers and Support Fighters. Now, in my opinion, one of the reasons why supercarriers and carriers are an internal balance problem is not just due to their high application, but also due to the simple fact that they can tackle for themselves. Through the use of sirens and dromies, a group of carriers can completely negate the need to bring subcapital support for themselves in order to tackle down their targets. What this ends up meaning in practice is that there's simply no reason to bring subcapital support in the first place, given that they will obviously have vastly less EHP than the carriers and supercarrier fleets that use these fighters, and supercarriers even have access to bubble launchers themselves after the 2016 rebalance, which takes away a key niche of interdictors and heavy interdictors, by allowing a mass carrier fleet to actually tackle for itself on a large scale. It is entirely true that you can, with enough time, kill off all the sirens and dromies that a carrier group can bring, but by that point, given the incredible DPS that they can put out, and the fact that fighters can move far faster than any subcapital, and as such easily get on top of you, it's most likely that your group of attackers will already be dead by that point. Beyond that, the actual cost of sirens and drommies is so little that killing a group of said fighters has no real impact on those using them, only costing around 20 million ISK a flight. Ultimately, I believe that support fighters being added to the game in the first place was a mistake. Capitals simply should not have the ability to support their own application to subcapitals, nor should they be able to lock their opponents on grid by themselves, as it removes a key niche that subcapitals are supposed to excel in. This also means that there's no need to actually sit down and craft a fleet composition before engaging an opposing fleet in a home defense situation. Just grab as many supers and facts as you can and jump to the sino. And this only helps increase the reaction speed that capitals are able to have in these sorts of scenarios, as your fleet will be able to utilize any tools they need once they've already entered the battlefield and attempted to scare off the people who've tackled a Rata or a Rorqual. As a result of this, I would suggest either completely removing support fighters from the game, or at the very least removing the tackling elements from them, changing the Drommy and the Siren to be paint and damp fighters respectively. Potentially, carriers could be given a small application buff in order to retain the original vision of carriers as anti-subcapital capitals, but I'd rather amputate the gangrenous limb and worry about reconstructive surgery later here. Section 2. Force Auxiliaries. Now, facts have a lot of problems in my opinion, but the biggest one is the fact that they are balanced around the DPS levels of capital warfare, and as an example of what I mean by this, here's a relatively cheap Master Race Apostle. If you throw this into Pi for yourself, you'll be able to see that even with its own boosts and no mindling, it can easily hit a tank of 50,000 EHP a second. Completely cap stable due to the fact that it is able to use 3200 cap boosters. This means that even if this Apostle is caught out on its own and isolated from its supporting fleet, it would still require 110 Munins or 50 Abaddons to be able to break the tank of it. With heat, a few more blingy modules and better boosts, you can almost double this tank for a short period of time, and that means that facts are effectively invulnerable to being burnt down by anything short of a strategic level fleet of subcapitals, and that amounts to a hilariously huge boost when compared to what pre-fax triage were able to self-rep for, which was around 10 to 20,000, maybe reaching up to 30,000 with some of the incredibly expensive fits that we started to see in wormholes near the end of their existence. If you then add this onto the fact that when in triage, a fax can lock faster, apply its reps faster, and ultimately rep nearly 10 times harder than the equivalent T2 logistics, fax become effectively an I win button in smaller fights, unless your opponent has the ability to escalate with capitals of their own, or you choose to bring a Triglavian doctrine. Add this on top of the existing power of capitals and supercapitals to punch down onto subcapitals without the need to bring subcapitals of their own, which some alpha doctrines might be able to volley through, and you end up with the incredible power of the so-called umbrella, which allows for nearly uninterruptible ratting, as long as you're in a big enough ship that won't die before backup arrives, as you never actually have to put anything on grid which might potentially die to a subcapital aggressing force. In capital versus capital situations, faxes are also fairly powerful as they can effectively neutralize opposing dread bombs, which is something I went through a good while ago. However, I've never claimed to be an expert in capital versus capital warfare, so I won't comment too heavily on it here. What I would suggest as a fix here is actually twofold. In order to deal with the power of Master Race fax, I'd simply reduce the amount that capital reps rep by 50 to 65%, and give Dreadnoughts a roll bonus to make up their lost rep power from that nerf. This would still allow fax to deal with smaller fleets and have the ability to mitigate some incoming damage, but will put them at a greater risk of subcapital escalation should they misjudge the size of the fleet they're facing. The next change is one that I know will likely be very controversial, but the other thing that I would suggest is nerfing the scan res bonus that the triage module gives by 33 to 50% in order to increase their lock time significantly on subcapitals. This would not impact their ability to lock capitals during combat heavily due to the logarithmic nature of lock times, but would increase their lock time on subcapitals to be well above that of subcapital logistics. And I believe this would force people to use subcapital logistics more often, at the very least as a stopgap before capital reps are able to land, leaving them with rep power to still be able to impact capital and subcapital warfare, but giving them a more defined weakness other than being locked in place, which doesn't matter too much when you're talking about engaging a citadel or some other static objective. Section 3. Titans. Now, much like carriers and supercarriers, Titans have the problem that they dominate any fight that they're introduced to with even a modicum of support or forethought. And whilst they lack the ability to actually augment their application, due to the fact that the tracking formula uses the distance from the center of the model to the center of the target model rather than edge-to-edge tracking, which is what the overview actually shows in terms of range. Titans, by sheer nature of being huge ships, have a massive bonus to tracking. If you sit at what your overview will tell you is 0 meters on an avatar, you'll actually be somewhere between 9 and 13 kilometers away from it as far as the tracking formula is concerned, which drastically reduces your ability to use sig tanking against them. This is on top of the fact that Titans can still use Hors, despite CSM 13, a CSM filled with arguably the biggest abusers of this mechanic, was unanimous in wanting them to be removed. To quote the minutes, Fozzie asks how they feel about the nuclear option of just banning Hors on Titans. CSM members nodded their heads and just said yes. This means that Titans have access to a weapon system which is primarily balanced around their usage on a Dread platform and its tracking levels, but with the inherent tracking bonus of being such a large ship. Not only do Titans have access to an incredibly powerful DPS platform in Hors, which allows them to clear off any tackle such as Hictors and Dictors without subcapital support, but this is then augmented by what is probably the single most powerful set of modules in the game, AoE Doomsdays. These have, in the modern metagame, effectively replaced real bombing runs, which at least took a huge amount of skill to set up, involved many pilots, and had counters in the form of defender missiles and firewalling. The counters to AoE DDs is simply to not be flying something which is slow enough to get hit by an AoE DD, as they can kill fully tanked battleships in 1 or 2 direct hits, completely wiping fleets off the face of the earth if properly positioned. And it's not even as if this is something which only affects big ships either, with bosons regularly being used to kill interceptors as they're coming out of warp in Delve. This makes Titans not only a ship with incredible raw power that only need to be supported with facts for a fully realised composition, but also the single biggest force multiplier in the game. And as a result, I'd suggest either completely removing AODDs completely, or making them only effectively apply to sieged or triaged caps, and again, as I suggested in the CSM 13 meeting, to simply disallow the fitting of Hors to them entirely, reserving those modules for Dreads only. Now, if you were to ask me the question, would this fix the game, I'd have to answer with absolutely not. There's plenty of other aspects to nullsec that need to be addressed in my opinion, such as the raw power of Cynos and instant escalation, the inherent drudgery of the Intosa system, not to mention the complete lack of meaningful small gang objectives which could drive content. But what I believe that these nerfs would do is to force the game back into a state where there is an actual escalation path, starting at subcapitals, then bringing in capitals to help augment your subcapitals, and finally bringing in supers to deal with opposing capitals, instead of just jumping to that last step and winning anyway. You're still going to have larger alliances be able to bring more subcapitals to bear, and probably fast enough to actively save their ratting assets in a decent percentage of cases, but at least it would allow those who attempt to interdict the Empires of Eve the opportunity to fight against ships which are in the same weight class as the ships that they can bring to bear, which would in turn hopefully lead to more interesting and meaningful fights, where the defenders have a chance of losing ships to people who are aggressing against them. Anyway, that's it for this video, so thank you for watching. And don't forget to leave your opinion below. I'd love to know what you think about the problems and solutions that I've identified here, and if you think I've got anything particularly wrong or particularly right. But until next time, don't forget, fly smart.